Welcome to the Oracle's Rest, a place where stories unfold slowly, where time softens, and where the mind is free to wander. Tonight, we step away from the warmth of the sun, away from the steady clarity of Apollo, and into something quieter, something cooler, more distant, a presence not defined by light, but by stillness, not by structure, but by space. Because while Apollo moved through the world, revealing patterns, bringing harmony, shaping understanding, there was another who chose something entirely different. Her name was Artemis, and from the very beginning, she did not belong to Olympus in the way the others did. She was born, like her brother, to Leto, on that same quiet, drifting island of Delos, a place untouched, unclaimed, existing between boundaries. And perhaps it is no coincidence that both of them began there, because Delos was not rooted, not fixed, not controlled. It simply existed. And Artemis, more than most, would carry that same quality forward. There are stories that say she was born first, that before Apollo came into the world, Artemis had already opened her eyes, already taken her first breath. And in that moment, something unusual happened. She did not remain a child. She did not wait or grow slowly into her place. Instead, she stepped immediately into awareness, into presence, into something that felt already complete. And when Apollo was born, it was Artemis who helped her mother, guiding the process, steady, composed, without hesitation. Even at the very beginning, she was not dependent. She was not uncertain. She did not look outward for direction. She simply acted. And this is where her story begins to take shape. Because while many of the gods are defined by what they seek, power, recognition, control, Artemis is defined by what she refuses. As she grew, there came a moment, a quiet but decisive one, where she stood before Zeus, not as a child asking for protection, but as something far more self-assured. And what she asked for was not what one might expect. She did not ask for a kingdom. She did not ask for influence over cities or people. She did not ask for admiration. Instead, she asked for distance, for space, for the ability to move freely. Without being bound, she asked to remain untouched, independent, unchanging. She asked for the wilderness, for mountains, forests, rivers, places where structure does not dominate, where life moves, but not according to rules set by others. And Zeus, perhaps recognizing something in her, something that did not need to be shaped, granted her these things. And in doing so, he allowed Artemis to exist outside the usual order, because while Olympus was filled with interaction, with conflict, with relationships that constantly shifted, Artemis stepped away from it, not in rejection, exactly, but in separation, a quiet decision that would define everything that followed. She became the goddess of the hunt, but not in the way that suggests violence, not chaos, not conquest, but precision, awareness, the ability to move through the world without disturbing it, to act only when necessary, to observe before engaging. There is something almost meditative in this, because hunting, at its core, is not about pursuit. It is about patience, stillness, listening, understanding the environment so completely that action becomes effortless. And this reflects Artemis more than anything else. She does not force outcomes. She aligns with them. She moves with the world rather than against it. And this is why she is so often found, not among the gods, but in the wilderness, surrounded not by crowds, but by quiet, by trees that do not speak, by rivers that do not ask, by open space that does not demand anything in return. Because in that space, there is no need to perform, no need to prove, only the simple act of existing. And for Artemis, that was enough. She was not drawn to Olympus because Olympus required interaction. It required presence in a way that felt constant, unavoidable. And Artemis chose something else. She chose distance, not out of fear, but out of clarity, because she understood something very early on, that not all connection brings balance, and not all closeness leads to peace. Sometimes space is what allows things to remain intact, And as her story continues, this choice, this quiet separation, begins to reveal its consequences, because while solitude offers freedom, it also creates boundaries, and Artemis does not allow those boundaries to be crossed. And as Artemis moved further from Olympus, further from structure, from expectation, from the constant presence of others, her world became more defined, not by boundaries placed upon her, but by boundaries she chose. The forests, the mountains, the quiet stretches of land untouched by cities. These became not only her domain, but her identity. And within that space, there was a kind of order, not imposed, not constructed, but understood. The movement of animals, the shifting of light through trees, the stillness that settles just before something changes. Artemis did not control these things. She observed them, aligned with them, and in time, she was no longer alone, because she was often accompanied by a group of companions, young women who, like her, chose a life apart from the expectations of the world. They moved with her through the wilderness, shared in her independence, lived without attachment to cities or to the structures of Olympus. And like Artemis, they existed within a very clear condition, a boundary that was not flexible, but absolute. They would remain untouched, free from obligation, free from control, free from being claimed. And this was not seen as restriction, but as freedom, because for Artemis, to remain unbound was not to lack something, it was to preserve something, to exist without interference, without expectation, without being drawn into the constant shifting dynamics of others. But boundaries, even when chosen, have consequences, because they do not only define what is allowed, they define what is not. And this becomes clear in one of the most well-known stories connected to Artemis, a story that begins not with intention, but with accident. There was a hunter named Actaeon, skilled, experienced, someone who understood the forest, who moved through it with familiarity. He was not reckless, not careless, but simply present within the same world Artemis inhabited. And one day, as he moved through the wilderness, he came upon something he was never meant to see. A clearing, still, quiet, almost untouched, and within it, Artemis, bathing, surrounded by her companions, unaware for a moment that anyone else was there. It is important to understand this moment, not as intrusion driven by intent, but as a crossing of boundaries without awareness. Actaeon did not seek her out. He did not approach with purpose. And yet, the result was the same, because for Artemis, the boundary was not conditional. It was absolute. To be seen in that moment, in that state of vulnerability, was not something she could allow. And so, the stillness of the scene shifted, not gradually, not subtly, but immediately. Artemis turned, and in that instant, recognition passed between them. Actaeon saw her, and she saw that he had seen. There is no drawn-out exchange here, no attempt to explain, no hesitation, because Artemis does not operate within uncertainty. She acts, and her response was swift, not loud, not chaotic, but precise. She reached for water and cast it toward him, and in that simple motion, something irreversible began. Actaeon's form shifted, not slowly, not with warning, but all at once. His body changed, his voice disappeared, his identity dissolved. He became a stag, not metaphorically, but fully. And in that transformation, something else became clear, because while Actaeon still possessed awareness, still understood what had happened, he could no longer communicate it, no longer explain, no longer return to what he had been. And then, from a distance, another presence approached, the sound of movement, of pursuit, his own hunting dogs, faithful, trained, responsive, but unaware. They did not see their master. They saw only prey, and instinct took over. What followed was not chaotic, but inevitable, because once the boundary had been crossed and the consequence set into motion, there was no reversal. Actaeon, once the hunter, became the hunted, and in a matter of moments, he was gone. There is something quiet, but deeply unsettling about this story, not because of violence, but because of certainty. There is no ambiguity, no gradual escalation, only a boundary, and what happens when it is crossed. And this is where Artemis differs from many of the other gods, because her actions are not driven by emotion alone, not by jealousy, not by pride, but by principle, a line that does not shift, a condition that does not adapt. And in this way, her world remains intact, uncompromised, but also unyielding. And as we continue to follow her story, we begin to see that this is not an isolated moment, but a pattern, because Artemis does not exist within negotiation. She exists within clarity, and clarity, when absolute, leaves no room for exception. And yet, even for one who chose solitude so completely, who built her world around distance and independence and the quiet certainty of her own boundaries, there were moments where something else entered. Not disruption, exactly, but presence. A presence that did not immediately conflict, did not demand, did not attempt to reshape what already existed, but simply appeared. There is a story, one that has been told in different ways across time, its details shifting slightly depending on who speaks it, but at its center remains the same figure, Orion. Orion was not like Actaeon. He was not unaware, not accidental, not simply passing through. He was a hunter, like Artemis. But where Artemis moved with restraint, with precision, with stillness, Orion carried something more forceful, more visible. He was known for his size, his strength, his presence in the world was not subtle. And yet, despite this, there are stories that suggest he and Artemis spent time together, not in conflict, but in something closer to companionship. They hunted together, moved across the same landscapes, shared the same awareness of the natural world, and for a time there was balance. This is where the story becomes quieter, but more complex, because Artemis, who had chosen distance from nearly all others, did not immediately reject Orion, and this alone suggests something significant, because for someone who does not allow boundaries to shift, any form of closeness carries weight. There are versions of the myth that say Orion respected her, that he did not attempt to control or claim or change her, that he simply existed alongside her. And in that space, something new began to form. not dependence, not attachment in the way it is often understood, but familiarity, a shared presence, and perhaps, for a moment, something that resembled trust. But stories, especially those shaped by many voices over time, rarely remain simple, because not all versions agree. Some tell of Orion becoming arrogant, speaking of his skill, his ability, claiming that he could hunt anything, that no creature could escape him. And this begins to shift the balance, because arrogance does not align with Artemis. It disrupts. It introduces something unpredictable, something excessive, and in another telling, it is not arrogance, but something else entirely. A moment where Orion turns his attention toward Artemis, not as equal, but as something to pursue, to possess. And this cannot exist within her world, because for Artemis, there is a clear distinction between presence and intrusion, between alignment and imbalance. And once that line is crossed, the outcome does not waver. There is also another version, one that brings Apollo back into the story, watching from a distance, seeing his sister in a way that felt unfamiliar, perhaps too close, too connected, and whether it was concern or something more subtle, something protective, or even controlling, he chose to intervene. He saw Orion far out in the distance, moving across the water, his form barely visible, and he spoke to Artemis, challenging her in the way only a sibling can, pointing to the distant shape, asking if she could strike it, if her precision, her skill, was truly as exact as it was said to be. Artemis, confident, steady, drew her bow, not in anger, not in suspicion, but in certainty, and she released. The arrow moved cleanly, cutting through the distance, and when it landed, the truth revealed itself. Slowly, quietly, inevitably, because the figure in the water was not unknown. It was Orion. There is no sudden outburst here, no chaos, no dramatic collapse, only recognition, the kind that settles deeply without needing to be expressed, because Artemis, once again, sees clearly and what she sees cannot be undone, whether through her own action or through the subtle influence of another. The result is the same. Orion is gone, and once again we return to a familiar pattern. Not pursuit, not punishment, but transformation. Orion does not disappear entirely. He is placed among the stars, a constellation, visible but distant, present but unreachable. And Artemis continues, as she always has, not returning to what was, not reshaping the past, but moving forward, within the same clarity that has always defined her. And this story, like the others, reveals something more than events. Because here we see something different, a moment where solitude and connection briefly intersect, where distance gives way, if only slightly, and where even that carries consequence. Because for Artemis, balance is not found through closeness, but through alignment. And when that alignment shifts, even slightly, the result is change, not loud, not chaotic, but permanent. And as we continue, her world returns once again to stillness, to space, to the quiet presence of one who remains apart. And as the stories of Artemis continue to unfold, moving through moments of distance, of consequence, of quiet and unchanging boundaries, another aspect of her presence begins to emerge, one that feels, at first, almost contradictory, because while Artemis is often remembered for her precision, for the certainty of her actions, for the way she responds when boundaries are crossed, she is also a protector, not in the way that suggests intervention at every moment, not as a constant force shaping outcomes, but as something more subtle, a presence that exists alongside vulnerability, particularly in moments where life itself is most fragile. Artemis became closely associated with young women, with children, and with the threshold between what has not yet fully formed and what is just beginning to emerge. She was called upon, not only in the wilderness, but in moments of transition, birth, growth, the movement from one stage of life into another. There is something deeply fitting in this, because Artemis, who had chosen independence so completely, who existed outside of expectation, became connected to those who had not yet been shaped by it, those who existed before roles were defined, before identity was fixed, before the world began to place its structures around them. And in this way, she became a guardian, not of outcomes, but of space, of the ability to remain for a time untouched, to exist without being immediately drawn into something else. This is why, in many parts of the ancient world, she was honored by those seeking protection during childbirth, a moment that sits precisely at the boundary between life and uncertainty, between emergence and risk. And here, once again, we see her dual nature, because Artemis was not only called upon to protect life, but also associated with its sudden ending. She was believed to bring swift, painless death, particularly to women, a release rather than a struggle, a transition rather than a rupture. And at first, this may seem difficult to reconcile. How can the same figure be present at the beginning of life and at its end? But when we look more closely, the connection becomes clear, because Artemis does not exist within the middle. She exists at the edge, at the threshold, at the point where something shifts. And this is consistent across everything she represents. The boundary between wild and civilized, between independence and connection, between presence and absence. And so, her role is not to maintain life continuously, but to guard its transitions, to stand at the moments where change occurs, and to ensure that those moments remain clear, uncompromised. There are also stories that show this protective aspect more directly. One of the most well-known involves a woman named Niobe. Niobe was not a goddess, but a queen. And like many figures in myth, her story begins with comparison, with pride. She spoke openly of her many children, of how she had more than Leto, more than the mother of Apollo and Artemis. And in doing so, she did not simply express gratitude. She elevated herself above and in the world of myth. This kind of comparison rarely goes unnoticed, because it disrupts balance. It shifts something that is meant to remain understood, but not challenged. Apollo and Artemis, hearing this, did not respond with words. They did not argue. They did not correct. They acted swiftly, precisely, without hesitation. Apollo struck Niobe's sons, one by one, and Artemis struck her daughters. There is no chaos in this moment, only sequence, action, followed by stillness, and Niobe left standing in the aftermath, witnessed the result of what had been set into motion, her grief, immense, her presence, unmoving, until, in some tellings, she is transformed into stone, still, but not absent, enduring, but unchanging. And once again, we see Artemis not as a figure of unpredictability, but of certainty, a boundary crossed, a consequence delivered, not gradually, not emotionally, but clearly. And this is what defines her. Not cruelty, not anger, but precision. A world where lines are visible, and where those lines remain intact. And yet, even within this, her role as protector remains, because she does not act without reason. She responds when balance shifts, when something exceeds its place, when something moves beyond what can remain stable. And in this way, she preserves something deeper, not individual outcomes, but the structure itself, the quiet order that exists beneath everything. And as we continue to move through her story, we begin to understand that Artemis is not defined by contradiction, but by consistency, a presence that exists exactly where it is needed, at the edge, at the moment of change, at the boundary between what was and what will be. And as these stories gathered around Artemis, stories of consequence, of protection, of sudden and irreversible change, the ancient world began to understand her in a way that went beyond any single myth. Because Artemis was not only a figure inside stories, she was also a presence people believed could be felt, invoked, honored, and feared, not only in poetry, but in life, in forests, at the edges of cities, in places where cultivated land gave way to wilderness, in temples raised far from crowded centers, in rituals connected to girls on the threshold of adulthood. in prayers whispered during childbirth, in offerings made before travel, before hunts, before uncertain transitions. And this is important because it tells us that Artemis was not imagined merely as a distant goddess of the wild. She was understood as one who presided over thresholds, over moments when identity had not yet settled, when safety was not yet guaranteed, when one state of being was ending and another had not fully begun. This role made her powerful, but it also made her difficult, because threshold gods are rarely simple. They do not belong fully to one side or the other. They stand between, and to stand between is to carry tension. Artemis belongs to birth and to death, to youth, but not to domestic adulthood, to companionship with her attendants, but not to dependence, to the hunt, but also to the protection of young animals, to motion and to stillness, to open air, moonlight, mountain silence, to that strange, almost sacred feeling of being far from walls, far from voices, far from expectation. And because she occupied all of these edges, she became a goddess whose favor mattered deeply. There is one story in particular that makes this unmistakably clear, a story that reaches into one of the largest and most important cycles in Greek myth, the Trojan War. Before the war could begin, before ships could cross the sea toward Troy, before heroes could become legends, the Greek fleet gathered at Aulis, warriors, kings, commanders, ships drawn together in anticipation. The purpose was clear. The destination was known. And yet, they could not leave. The winds had stopped. The sea remained still. The sails would not fill. No matter how ready the army believed itself to be, movement would not come. And in myth, when the natural world ceases to cooperate, it is rarely meaningless. Something had been disturbed. Something had been offended. And the figure tied to that stillness, to that refusal, was Artemis. The reasons differ in different versions of the story, as they often do in myths retold across generations. In one telling, Agamemnon had killed a sacred deer. In another, he had boasted that his skill as a hunter surpassed that of Artemis herself. And boasting, as the myths repeatedly make clear, is never merely speech. It is a disturbance of order. It places the self where reverence should be. It assumes equality where there is none. Whatever the exact offense, the result was the same. Artemis withheld the wind. An entire army delayed. A vast expedition suspended. Not by battle, not by strategy, but by the stillness of nature itself. And this is one of the clearest expressions of her power, because Artemis does not always need to strike directly. She can simply refuse passage, refuse cooperation, refuse motion. And when she does, nothing proceeds. The Greeks turned to prophecy, as they so often did when direct action failed, and the answer they received was terrible. To restore the wind, to allow the fleet to sail, Agamemnon would have to sacrifice his daughter, Iphigenia. There is something especially cold and difficult about this story, because it takes the familiar structure of war myth, preparation, command, heroic purpose, and interrupts it with something intimate, not armies, but family, not conquest, but cost. Iphigenia was brought to Aulis under false pretenses in some versions, told she was to be married, summoned not for death, but for celebration. And this detail matters, because it emphasizes the cruelty of transition when it is distorted. Marriage itself was a threshold in the ancient world, a movement from one status into another. And here, that threshold is darkened, transformed into something else. She arrives expecting one future and meets another. Some versions of the myth end with sacrifice fulfilled. Iphigenia dies and the winds return. The fleet sails. History, or mythic history, continues. The war begins. But other versions offer a different ending. At the final moment, Artemis intervenes, substituting a deer upon the altar, taking Iphigenia away, carrying her to Tauris, where she becomes a priestess in Artemis's service, preserved but removed, alive but no longer part of ordinary life. And this variation is deeply revealing, because it shows again that Artemis is not always reducible to punishment. She is also transformation, removal from one world into another, passage across a boundary that cannot be uncrossed. If Iphigenia dies, Artemis is the terrible goddess who demands rebalancing. If Iphigenia is spared, Artemis is the goddess who claims what is hers and relocates it into sacred distance. Either way, the message is the same. What belongs to Artemis cannot be treated casually. Not the deer of the wild, not the silence of the wind, not the threshold between girlhood and womanhood, not the life of one standing at the edge of change. And this is why her myths feel so different from those of gods who rule through spectacle. Her power is often quiet, but it is absolute. She does not need to overwhelm the world. She only needs to withhold it, and in that withholding, people come to understand exactly where they stand. There is another story that reveals a different aspect of this same principle. The story of Callisto. Callisto was one of Artemis's companions, a follower within her circle. And that circle, as we have already seen, was not casual. It was defined by vows, by shared distance from ordinary structures, by a life arranged around chastity, independence, and loyalty to Artemis's way of being. To enter that circle was to agree to its terms. And like all things connected to Artemis, those terms were not symbolic. They were real. Callisto's story also exists in different forms, but the central pattern remains. Zeus desired her. And whether through deception, disguise, force, or seduction, depending on the version, Callisto became pregnant. What matters for Artemis's story is not only Zeus's action, but what follows. The hidden truth cannot remain hidden forever. Eventually, the change in Callisto's body is seen, often during bathing, another recurring motif in Artemis myths. Moments of exposure. Moments when what is concealed becomes visible, and once again, visibility brings consequence. Artemis learns the truth. In some tellings, she reacts with anger. In others, she simply expels Callisto from her company. And this distinction is worth noticing. Because even when Artemis is harsh, what defines her is not emotional chaos. It is enforcement of structure. Callisto can no longer remain in the circle she once belonged to. The vow has been broken, even if not freely. The world Artemis governs does not bend to accommodate complexity. It preserves the line. And Callisto is cast out. What follows becomes one of those myths where suffering spreads outward. Hera, enraged as so often in the stories of Zeus's desires, transforms Callisto into a bear, a creature both noble and feared, powerful and exiled. And later, Callisto's son Arcas nearly kills her while hunting, not knowing who she is. Only at the end are they translated into the sky as constellations. Ursa Major and Ursa Minor in later tradition. Once again, transformation replaces restoration. The old life is not returned. Instead, the broken pattern is lifted elsewhere, fixed into a new form, and Artemis stands once more as a figure whose domain cannot be entered halfway. One either belongs or does not. One remains within the vow or passes beyond it. There is little middle ground. This can feel severe to modern ears, and in truth, it was severe even within the imagination of the ancient world. But severity is part of what made Artemis intelligible. She represented a form of order that is not negotiated socially. It exists like a law of the landscape, like the cliff edge, the winter cold, the animal that will not let itself be touched. These are not cruel because they resist us. They simply are what they are. And Artemis, more than perhaps any other Olympian, preserves that sense of reality untouched by persuasion. This is also why her connection to the moon became so enduring. Though the earliest Greek traditions distinguish more carefully between lunar goddesses such as Selene and Hecate, over time, Artemis absorbed strong associations with moonlight, night travel, silver radiance, and the cool illumination of darkness. This pairing makes deep symbolic sense. Apollo, her twin, comes to embody solar clarity, public light, music, proportion, visible order. Artemis embodies another kind of clarity, not daylight, but night vision, not what is displayed, but what is sensed, not the city square, but the forest path. Moonlight does not flood the world. It does not explain everything. It leaves shadows intact. It reveals enough to move, enough to perceive form, without destroying mystery. And that is very much Artemis's kind of seeing. She is not a goddess of full disclosure. She is a goddess of alertness, of movement through uncertainty, of preserving oneself without surrendering to fear. In moonlight, one does not dominate the landscape. One listens to it. One notices shape, distance, silence. One becomes careful, measured. And this is why Artemis feels so at home there, because her wisdom is not the wisdom of speeches or counsels. It is the wisdom of instinct disciplined into awareness, the wisdom of knowing when to stop, when to move, when to remain hidden, when to preserve distance, when not to cross the clearing, when not to speak too loudly into the stillness. And once we begin to see Artemis this way, her myths gather into a more unified whole. Actaeon is not merely a punishment story. It is a lesson in violated space. Orion is not merely tragedy. It is the instability that enters when companionship approaches what solitude was built to protect. Niobe is not merely revenge. It is pride, disrupting reverence. Iphigenia is not merely sacrifice. It is the cost of offending what governs transition. Callisto is not merely exile. It is the collapse of belonging when a vow is broken and a circle can no longer hold. Each story returns to the same center. Artemis stands where things are still becoming. And because of that, her world must remain guarded, not softened beyond recognition, not endlessly interpreted, but guarded. There is substance in that, and perhaps also discomfort, because so much of ordinary life depends on compromise, on conversation, on adaptation. Artemis represents something older than that, a law before discussion, a line that cannot be persuaded, and that is part of why she remains so compelling. She gave form to the experience of sacred distance, to the intuition that some spaces in life must remain unwounded. Some aspects of the self must not be handed over carelessly. Some seasons of being are not meant for constant closeness. And as we continue, what begins to emerge is not merely the portrait of a goddess, but the outline of an idea. That independence is not emptiness. That solitude is not failure of connection. That restraint may preserve what constant interaction would dissolve. And Artemis, moving beneath trees, across ridgelines, through the pale and careful light of night, becomes the shape of that idea, not warm in the way Apollo is warm, not domestic, not easily comforting, but clear and profoundly intact. And as the stories of Artemis move beyond individual myths, beyond moments of transformation, of consequence, of boundaries held and enforced, we begin to see her not only as a figure within narrative, but as a presence that shaped real practices, real places, real moments in human life. Because for those who honored Artemis, she was not distant. She was near, particularly at the edges of change. One of the most significant places connected to her worship was Broron, a sanctuary in Attica, not far from Athens, set slightly apart, near water, surrounded by land that felt quieter than the city. a place that reflected her nature, not fully removed, but not entirely integrated. And it was here that young girls were brought, not as a casual visit, but as part of a transition, because before they entered adulthood, before they were drawn into the structures of marriage, of expectation, of defined roles, they spent time in the presence of Artemis, participating in rituals that may seem unusual now, but carried deep symbolic meaning. They were known, in some accounts, as Arctoi, little bears, clothed in saffron robes, moving in simple, structured ways, performing dances, gestures, actions that marked a shift. Not yet women, no longer children, but something in between. And this is where Artemis's role becomes especially clear, because she is not the goddess of what comes after. She does not preside over marriage, over domestic life, over the structured continuation of society. She stands before that, at the moment where identity is still forming, where something must be released before something else can begin. The rituals at Orion were not about becoming something immediately. They were about preparation, about honoring the stage of life that exists just before transformation, and then allowing it to pass. Because Artemis does not hold people indefinitely. She guards the threshold, but she does not prevent movement through it. And this is an important distinction, because it shows that her distance, her separation, is not about isolation without purpose. It is about preserving the integrity of transition, allowing each stage to exist fully before it changes, and then letting it go. There is another place, far from Orion, that reveals a very different expression of Artemis. The city of Ephesus. Here, Artemis appears almost unrecognizable at first, not the solitary huntress of the forests, not the quiet figure moving beneath trees, but something more expansive, more symbolic. She was worshipped as a great goddess of fertility, of life, of abundance. Her image, carved into statues, shows a figure adorned with many rounded forms across her chest, interpreted in different ways, as breasts or as symbols of nourishment, of provision. A figure not of restraint, but of overflowing life. And this difference is striking, because it shows that Artemis, like many ancient deities, was not fixed to a single interpretation. she adapted, not in her core nature, but in how she was understood by those who honored her. At Ephesus, she becomes not only the guardian of the untouched, but the source of life itself. And this might seem contradictory, but when viewed more carefully, it aligns, because both forms, the distant huntress and the life-giving figure, exist at the same boundary, the point where life begins, where it emerges from something unseen, whether in the wild or in the human world. Artemis remains tied to that moment, not to what follows, but to the beginning itself. And this is why her identity feels so layered, because she is not confined to a single role. She is a presence that appears differently, depending on where the boundary is being experienced. In the forest, she is distance. In ritual, she is transition. In Ephesus, she is emergence. But always, she stands at the edge, never fully within, never entirely outside. And over time, her connection to the moon becomes more pronounced, not as an original assignment, but as a natural extension of what she represents. Because the moon, like Artemis, does not dominate the sky. It does not erase darkness. It moves within it, illuminating just enough to reveal shape without removing mystery, to guide movement without overwhelming perception. And in that soft silver light, there is a kind of awareness, different from the clarity of day, more subtle, more intuitive, more attuned to presence than to explanation. And this is where Artemis resides most completely, not in brightness, but in quiet visibility, in the ability to sense without needing full understanding, to move without needing control, to remain without needing constant connection. And as her story settles into this space, what begins to emerge is not simply a collection of myths, but a pattern, a way of being that has remained consistent from beginning to end. Because Artemis never becomes something else. She does not evolve into a different role. She does not seek expansion. She remains, and the world shifts around her. And perhaps this is why her presence feels so steady, because it is not built on reaction, but on clarity, the clarity to know what must remain separate, the clarity to recognize when a boundary has been crossed, the clarity to act without hesitation, and also the clarity to allow, to stand at the edge and let life move forward without interference. And this idea, though ancient, is not distant. It appears in quieter ways, in the need for space, for moments untouched by expectation, for time that is not shaped by constant interaction, for the recognition that not everything must be shared or explained or brought into the center. Some things remain whole precisely because they are not. And in that understanding, there is a kind of balance, not created through control, but through preservation, through the quiet decision to remain where one is most aligned. And as the story begins to soften, as the movement of thought slows, as the need to follow each idea begins to fade, Artemis does not disappear. She remains at the edge of the forest, in the stillness of night, in the space between what has been and what has not yet begun, not asking, not reaching, only present, only aware, only still. And in that stillness, there is nothing to resolve, nothing to change, nothing to pursue, only the quiet sense that everything has its place and that not all things are meant to be held. Some are meant to remain just beyond reach.